His name was Vladimir Lenin. Born on April 22, 1870, he was a Russian revolutionary, author, lawyer, economic theorist, political philosopher, creator of the Soviet Communist Party, leader of the October Revolution of 1917, and founder of the USSR. As head of the Bolsheviks, he led the Red Army to victory in the Russian Civil War before establishing the world's first socialist state. As a theorist, his extensive theoretical and philosophical contributions to Marxism produced Leninism.
Что такое советская власть? В чем заключается сущность этой новой власти, которой не хотят или не могут понять еще в большинстве стран? Сущность ее, привлекающая к себе рабочих каждой страны все больше и больше, состоит в том, что прежде государством управляли так или иначе богатые или капиталисты, а теперь первый раз управляют государством, притом в массовом числе как раз те классы, которых капитализм угнетал. Даже в самой демократической, даже в самой свободной республике, пока остается господство капитала, пока земля остается в частной...
However, in 1918, his life began to take a terrible turn. He had 2 assassination attempts on him. We have reenacted these 2 assassination attempts. We warn you that these reenactments are highly dramatized. The first occurred on January 14, 1918. After a speech, assassins shot at Lenin in his automobile. He and Fritz Platten were in the car when assassins began shooting. The second occurred on the 30th of August, 1918. While walking to his car from a speech, assassin Fanya Kaplan fired 3 shots at him, hitting him in the arm, jaw, and neck. He fortunately survived.
He was a traitor! He was a traitor!
These injuries took a toll on his body, this and the stress of forming a new country were many factors leading to the series of 4 strokes he will have. On May 26, 1922, Lenin suffered the first of 4 strokes. We have reenacted these strokes. Being extremely over-dramatized, these are just simply what could have happened when he stroked. The second stroke occurred on December 15, 1922, 7 months after his first stroke and just 15 days before the forming of the USSR. So I have this policy here. It's going to involve rapes and killing Russian girls, but that's okay. You know, there's many... The third stroke occurred on March 9, 1923, only 3 months after his second. Finally, on January 12, 1924, Lenin suffered his 4th stroke. He died from complications. After his death, the notorious Joseph Stalin came to power. His ideals of collectivization, industrialization, and communism took a huge toll on the USSR. Millions and millions of people died because of this. Joseph Stalin's process of collectivization was taking the peasants' farms into government control. The peasants had no choice. We talked to Russian peasant Adrian Trudnovsky, who experienced this firsthand. So there I was doing my farm work one day, and all of a sudden these Soviet troops come into my yard and they tell me to get out and leave and go find a place to live because they're taking my farm away. So there I was, left with nothing, absolutely scrapped, and I was forced to live in nowhere, on the streets, while the Soviets took over my land.
How do you feel about that?
Well, it sucked, obviously. It really angered me, and I hoped that every day that Stalin would die. Anyone who spoke out against Stalin was immediately killed.
What do you want? Get off my land.
This is my land. You
Get down.
No.
Get down.
You suck.
Get down.
No.
Get down.
No, you get off my land.
Get down.
You get off my land. With Stalin in power, events like the Berlin Wall and the Cold War happened. However, what would happen if Lenin survived his fourth stroke? What if he was able to fully recover and live for another 15 years? If this happened, history would be completely different. That is what we're going to look at right now. On January 12, 1924, Lenin suffered his fourth stroke. Fortunately, he was revived with little time to spare. Two days later, he was released from the hospital with a warm welcome from the crowds. On January 21st, 1924, People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs for the Soviet Union, Leon Trotsky, called a secret meeting with Lenin to discuss problems that may arise with Stalin. This is where a critical decision was made.
So, called a meeting today because we need to talk about Stalin.
What's up with him?
I think he's going to put a hit out on you. I mean, his views are going against yours. I mean, the polls are showing that you're ahead, but he wants it. He has this thing called collectivization, and he really wants to put that in effect. If he gets you out, then there's no competition.
Yeah, that could cause a lot of problems. We gotta get rid of him.
Yeah.
Kill him. Do
Good
it.
idea.
Absolutely. On January 24th, when leaving a public speech, Joseph Stalin was shot 3 times, once in the head and twice in the chest. The person that killed him is still not known today. His body now remains in a mausoleum located in Red Square in the center of Moscow. Leon Trotsky was then appointed General Secretary the following day. For the next 15 years, Lenin was able to maintain a peaceful country and also reach his goals of the new economic policy. His new economic policy called for a growth in small businesses to maintain private profit, while the government controlled large industries, banks, and foreign trade. This policy worked out very well in the Soviet Union. In 1940, Lenin died from complications of an aneurysm. He now rests next to Stalin in the mausoleum. Leon Trotsky replaced Lenin and continued to follow his policies. Trotsky died in 1945, and a line of presidents have served since then. The policies of Lenin are still followed today, and the Soviet Union has a prosperous economy. The current president of the Soviet Union is Dmitry Medvedev. After the death of Lenin, Joseph Stalin beat out Leon Trotsky to take control over the USSR. The first step he took when in office was to abolish Lenin's new economic policy and introduce his new 5-year plan. The goal of this plan was to industrialize the Soviet Union, at the cost of the people. As mentioned earlier, millions of people died because of this. Peasants were thrown off their farms, and if they spoke out, were immediately executed. If Lenin did not die, the 5-year plan would not have been established, and the new economic policy would still be in effect today. On March 5, 1946, Winston Churchill gave his famous speech in Fulton, Missouri. He talked about the spread of communism in Europe. His famous lines, "An iron curtain has descended upon Europe," are still remembered today. However, with Lenin in power, there would be no such thing as communism spread, or the Iron Curtain. In 1948, following disagreements regarding reconstruction in a new German currency, Stalin instituted the Berlin blockade, preventing food, materials, and supplies from arriving in West Berlin. The United States, Britain, France, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and several other countries began a massive Berlin airlift, supplying West Berlin with food and other supplies. The Soviets started a public relations campaign against the Western policy change, Communists attempted to disrupt the elections of 1948, while 300,000 Berliners demonstrated for the international airlift to continue. In May 1949, Stalin lifted the blockade, permitting Western shipments to Berlin. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961. It closed off all Germans' access to West Berlin from 1961 to 1989 and served as a symbol of the Cold War's division of East and West Germany. The barrier was built in response to the flight of about 2.5 million East Germans to West Germany in the years 1949 to 1961. First built on the nights of August 12th through the 13th, 1961, it developed into a system of concrete walls topped with barbed wire and guarded with watchtowers, gun emplacements, and mines. The wall was opened in the 1989 democratization that swept through Eastern Europe. However, if Lenin did not die, the Berlin Wall and the Berlin airlift would not have happened. Lenin had no intentions of expanding west. This would leave him no reason to build a wall around Berlin and stop supplies from going through. While Stalin attempted to spread communism, the countries in the West came together. In March 1948, the Treaty of Brussels was formed. Countries like Belgium, France, and Great Britain came together in cooperation with economic and military matters. In April 1949, more Western countries came together to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO. It still exists today. However, if Lenin did not die and Stalin never came to power, there would be no reason for these Western countries to come together and form these pacts. They would have never existed. Throughout the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were in a nuclear arms race. Each country wanted to be better than the other. The United States' goal was to outspend the Soviets. They succeeded. The Soviets continued to buy more and more supplies. They eventually ran out of money and the economy took a severe hit. If Lenin had not died, the two countries would have no reason to spend more and more money to become better than the other. Yes, there would still be production of nuclear arms, but not to the extent that the Soviet people would be severely affected by this. The space race was a mid to late 20th century competition between the Soviet Union and the United States for supremacy in outer space exploration. Between 1957 and 1975, rivalry between the two nations focused on attaining first in space exploration. This was seen as necessary for national security and symbolic of technology and ideological superiority. The Soviets succeeded in getting into space first with the launching of Sputnik 1 on October 4, 1957. However, 4 months later, the U.S. launched U.S. Explorer 1 on January 31, 1958. If Lenin had not died, the space race would not have happened. The two countries would not be pressured into getting into space as fast as possible. However, we would still be in space today, it just would not have happened as fast as it did. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a confrontation among the Soviet Union, Cuba, and the United States in October 1962 during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was storing weapons in Cuba while planning a potential strike on the USA. The USA blockaded Cuba so the Soviet Union could not go in or get out. Until finally on November 5, 1962, the Soviet Union loaded the weapons on ships. Then a month later on December 4th, the weapons were shipped back to the Soviet Union. If Lenin had not died, the Soviets would not have had weapons, and they certainly would not have had stored them in Cuba. This is just another one of the events during the Cold War that would not have happened. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a process of systematic disintegration, which occurred in its economy, social structure, and political structure. It resulted in the destruction of the Soviet federal government and independence of the USSR's republics on December 25, 1991. The 1991 Soviet coup was an attempt by a group of members of the Soviet Union's government to take control of the country from Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. The coup leaders were members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, who were opposed to Gorbachev's reform program in the new Union Treaty. A few months later, in the early hours of December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR, declaring the office extinct and ceding all powers in it to the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. That night, the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin. The next day, the Council of Republics of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union formally recognized the dissolution of the Soviet Union. If Lenin had not died, the Soviet Union would still exist today. With his new economic policy and the thriving economy, the country would be strong enough to survive.
That is the story of Vladimir Lenin. If he had survived his last stroke, the events of history would have changed drastically and the European world would have been a completely different place.